Welcome to Grace Bible Church Pearlside Online. Pastor Steve Murrell, president of our Every Nation Ministries, visits us with a powerful message of purpose. Is life about achieving our own personal goals or something far greater?
Get over your selfie. Get over yourself. And we want to talk about how to do that tonight. And first I want to tell you a story. A couple of years ago, actually it's been quite a few years ago, my boys were younger. They were like 6, 8, and 10. And we were at a beach resort a few hours south of Manila and in Anilao. And the resort was owned by my neighbors. And they were friends of ours. They had kids the same age as ours, and so we were going down to their place. And it's one of these, you can imagine the cliff, the mountain came right down to the water, and the cottages were built into the side of the mountain, and then there was a swimming pool right next to the beach, which I never understood that, why you put a pool next to the beach, but they did. And they had a water slide that came down from the mountain into the pool, okay? So you've got this nice pool and a water slide and the beach, and the sun is setting over the South China Sea, and we're about to have dinner. We're sitting there watching the water. My kids are playing somewhere, and there's this about a 10-year-old kid who keeps sliding down and splashing, and then he looks at his dad who's in this lounging in this chair. He's an American guy, and he's got a green coconut he's drinking buko juice with a straw and a little umbrella stuck at the top of it, okay? And probably had some mixture in there besides the coconut juice. And he's watching this, and his son is going, "Come on, Dad, you have to come try the slide." And the dad's kind of not paying attention. And the son slides again. "Come on, Dad, the water's perfect. It's not too cold. Come on." And he's coaxing his dad, and the dad goes, No, not now. I'm watching the sunset." And then the boy goes, "Why are you watching the sunset?" And the dad got real philosophical for a moment. And he peered out over the South China Sea at this beautiful, colorful sunset. And he says, "Son, because when you're 40, watching a sunset is the meaning of life." I thought, ooh, I need to hear some spooky music back there. Sounds deep and profound. And I could see that kid thinking, but when you're 10 years old, a water slide is the meaning of life. Here's the question: is the meaning of life something that changes with age? Is it something that we can just pick and make the meaning of our life whatever we want it to be? I'm proposing to you tonight that we need to get over ourselves and get into what God says is the reason, the meaning, the purpose of life. It's not something we can pick and choose. And you'll find that when we pick and choose the reason for our existence, when we pick and choose the purpose for our life, when we pick and choose and make up the meaning and the reason, it's usually a disaster. And it's usually not a life well lived, it's usually a life wasted. When we manufacture a meaning or a reason or a purpose around our own appetites, around our own desires, around our own self-centered, seemingly important needs at the moment. And when we have a meaning and a reason for our life that floats and changes depending on the mood we're in that week, or depending on whatever the latest television show or the latest fashion trend is. I'm submitting to you tonight, there is a fixed reason for human existence. And it's not up to us to choose what we want that to be. It's up to us to discover that and submit to it and embrace it. But to do that, we have to do what this series is called. We've got to get over our selfies in order to embrace God's meaning and God's reason and God's purpose. And to do that, we want to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 1 through 3. Ecclesiastes is an odd book in the Bible. If you don't have your Bible, you can look on the screen up here. We'll have the scripture on there. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1 through 3. Ecclesiastes is not a how-to book. There's nothing practical at all about it. It's actually, if you don't understand it, it's actually quite depressing if you just read it chapter by chapter and don't read it all the way to the end. If you stop halfway through, you might be pretty dark and you might get a little suicidal. Because it's sad until you read the last few lines. Here it is, verse 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Anybody have a guess who that is? The son of David, the king in Jerusalem. There you go. Solomon David's son, the king in Jerusalem. So Solomon's writing this. He's actually dictating it to his scribe. And you'll find the last few verses of Ecclesiastes, it's sort of the scribe's commentary and summary notes on the rest of the book that's been dictated to him. You can see when it changes voices after the first few verses in chapter 12. Okay, so this is Solomon. Verse 2. Interesting and kind of a strange verse here. Watch this. Verse 2. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. 5 times in this little short verse. Vanity, 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 vanity. Okay, we get the point. 29 more times he uses the word vanity in this book of Ecclesiastes. But right here in verse 2, he tells us the theme. Now, this is 2,600 years ago. When you and I want to emphasize something, here are my notes on my iPad. Some things are in all caps, some things are in red, some things have a neon green box. I do all kinds of things to emphasize my notes. In those days when Solomon's dictating to his scribe to write this, he couldn't just click on a 16-point font. He couldn't put a green neon box around it or make it italics or all caps or bold or all the things we do to create emphasis when we're doing communication. So the way they would make an emphasis, like an all caps, super bold, italics, underlined, circled, that would be just repetition. So vanity, 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 vanity. Okay, we get it. That's bold. That's all caps. That's circled, underlined, neoned. There's a point. This is the hinge of the whole book. This is the theme. This is what this is going to be about. So watch that. Vanity of vanities. And then verse 3, he asks a powerful and pertinent question to all of us. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? That phrase, under the sun, pops up over and over and over in this book. And what it means by that, it's a poetic way of saying, what's the point of living if it's just earth, but there's no spiritual or eternal connection? Living a horizontal life with no vertical part to it. He goes on this under the sun, living under the sun is useless. It's not like a sunscreen commercial that you're going to get burned or something. It's about this metaphor about living an earthly life without any eternal or vertical aspect to it. Now, a little bit about King Solomon. If you remember Solomon, David's son, if you've read it in the Bible, great. If you haven't, it's an interesting story. Solomon started out as a very humble man, as a very gracious, he was a young leader who really wanted to get it right. And he was hungry for God, and he was seeking God, and he was trying his best to be a humble, gracious, godly leader. He had a dream that's recorded in the Bible where God appears to him and says, ask anything you want. You want riches? You want chariots? You want palaces? You want fame? You want whatever you want. You can have it. It's all yours. And Solomon chooses wisely, and he says, I want wisdom, because the people you've called me to lead deserve great leadership. I need your help, God. I need your wisdom. And God was so pleased that he didn't choose wealth and a bunch of women and all the things that people would choose. He chose wisely. And so you find out right at the beginning of Solomon's life, he's making good choices. He's making godly choices. He's doing things to honor God. He's heeding all of the warnings of his father, and he's really getting off to a right start. But then a strange thing happens. Success happens. Prosperity happens. Abundance happens. Wealth happens. Power happens. Fame happens. And all of these things detour Solomon way off of God's course for his life. And I find it odd that most of the time people who don't have prosperity and they don't have success and they don't have things, they're still pursuing something in life, they tend to cry out to God. But the sad thing is, once people get a little bit of success and a little bit of money and a little bit of prosperity and a little bit of whatever, those things tend to pull us away from God, even sometimes when they're things from God, when they're blessings from God. So often they become a distraction from us and we lose sight of what this was really about. We lose sight of the reason. We lose sight of the purpose. We lose sight of meaning, and we get back to self instead of having our eyes on God. And this is what happened to Solomon. And he goes way off. He detours his life. He gets off of God's path. And now this book, the book of Ecclesiastes, is written at the end of Solomon's life. He's now an old man. He's wrinkled. He's gray. He's hunched over. He's got white hair. And he's looking back over his life. And he's writing a summary. And he's dictating it to his scribe. And what he does, if you read the book of Ecclesiastes, he talks about the things he wasted his life in. He talks about the accumulation of money and gold and wealth, and he talks about that. Then he says, but that is this word we're talking about, vanity. And that word vanity in the scriptures, it's an interesting word. The Old Testament was originally written primarily in Hebrew, a little bit of Aramaic, a little bit of other, but primarily in Hebrew. And the original word there, the one we're reading now, it says vanity in the English Standard Version. The NIV, does anybody read NIV here? The NIV Bible says meaningless. Meaningless. Meaningless, says the preacher. And he uses that word meaningless. And so it's vanity. It's meaningless. But the original Hebrew word, and I'll destroy the way I pronounce this, is habel. And what that word literally means, yes, it means vanity. Yes, it means meaningless. That's the figurative meaning. What it literally means is mist. Figuratively, it means other things, temporary and something of no substance, vanity, meaningless, that type of thing. But literally mist. About 6 weeks ago in our church in Manila, we were recording a live worship album. And our team brought in the lights and the 4 cameras and the big boom cranes and all that to make to make music videos to go with the album that's being launched in a few weeks. And when I was going through looking at the budget of things I was going to have to pay for in order to make these YouTube videos where people could get our music for free instead of buying it, which really made no sense to me, but that's the way it works, okay? I know some of you, in the earlier service, they wanted cassette tapes of the music. Ask your grandparents about cassette tapes. But they had on the budget a mist machine. And I said, why do we want a mist machine? And they explained to me that for the video to look cool, we had to create a mist in the room. Not a fog machine, that blows it on the stage. They had that. They already had that. But we needed a mist machine that would fill the room with invisible mist. And when the spotlights shine through the mist, the light reflects off of the mist particles or whatever they are, and it creates this really cool effect of stripes in the air. You know what I'm talking about? And when I'm going, why do we want that? And so then they said, don't you ever watch music videos? No. Have you never seen a Hillsong's music video? No. Okay, so anyway, we did it, all right? So we did it, and it made the air striped. So it's really going to be a cool video when it releases. It's going to make the song sound amazing. Now, the mist machine. Now, that was 6 weeks ago. The room was filled with mist 3 days in a row. I preached in that same church building last Sunday in Manila, and the mist was gone. There was no sign of the mist. Even when they put the spotlights, there was no stripe. There was no cool factor. It was just light. The mist was gone 5 minutes after we unplugged the mist machine 6 weeks ago. The mist was gone. You cannot get your hands on it. There's no substance. It is so temporary. And that's what Solomon is saying life is. Life lived for the wrong reason. Life lived for the wrong person. Life lived for the wrong purpose. Life lived for selfies. Living a life to fulfill our appetites and our every desire and what we think is important with no reference point to God, that kind of life is vanity. It's meaningless. It's a mist. And if we go through life living our purpose and our desire and what pleases us rather than God's purpose and God's desire and what pleases God, our life will be like the mist. It'll be for nothing. It will be gone no matter what we think we achieve. Meaningless. mist, vanity, and then it goes down now to that final question that's asked. Verse 3. In verse 3, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? In other words, what's the point? What's the reason? Why are we doing this? Is there more to life than going to college, getting a degree so we can get a job to pay the debt we accumulated in college? Is that the meaning of life? Is there more to it than that? Is it now that I've got a job, I get up in the morning and drink my coffee so I can get in the traffic and get to work, so then I can end work and I can get in traffic and go home and watch the TV shows I TiVo'd? Is that it? Is there more to it than that? Just living for the weekend or the vacation or the brand on the watch or the kind of shoes that I saw in the magazine? And then if I have to do like those squatter kids and buy my shoes at Payless, then I'm somehow less important than the person who bought them at the knockoff Jimmy Choo place? Is there more to live for than that? Solomon says, look, I lived for money and it was empty. I got a lot of it and I was still empty. I lived for women and all of the women and the immorality. I lived for that and that was pleasurable for a moment, he says, but at the end it was empty. I lived for fame and power and be on the front of the magazines and everybody would ooh and ah when I walked in the room. I tried that and that was empty. And one thing after another, he's going through and going, life lived that way is a mist. There's no substance to that kind of life. So he asked the question in verse 3, is there a reason? Now Solomon is looking, he's an Old Testament guy. The Old Testament Jewish people were looking for a Messiah, promised from God, a Savior that he would send and set the world right side up and fix what was wrong with the world, which was sin. They were waiting for that, and he's looking. There's got to be a reason. Now he gets to chapter 12, and he talks about serving God and fearing God and honoring God. And he says the best thing you can do in chapter 12, verse 1 is, look, when you're young, serve God until you're old. In other words, he's going, don't do what I did. Don't start off when you're young, living right, and detour and waste most of your life, and then come to your senses as an old person. And Solomon's pleading, don't do it that way. Don't turn your life that could have been valuable and meaningful and do something that honors God. Don't turn it into a mist. Vanity, meaningless, waste. Don't do it. But is there something? We are like Solomon looking forward to a Messiah. We are 2,600 years into the future looking back through church history. And we're looking back through 2,000 years of church history to the cross of Christ. And the cross becomes our lens that helps us interpret everything. And when we look through the cross, we see there is a reason. We see God has a reason and God has a purpose. I was talking to Pastor Billy earlier. We were talking about some physical challenges that his son has and that my son went through. My oldest son's 28 now. And I was looking back on the difficulties of my son having a blood disease that was no known cause and no known cure. And wrestling through the effects of that. But looking back, I see, and it's hard to understand. I know God heals people. I told you a story earlier about it. And during that time, I can remember many people would come to me when my son, we would pray constantly, and it was not getting better, it was getting worse. We would pray for people at church. I've got some of the most amazing healings that happened at our church during that time. And I would go home to a son that I couldn't do anything about. God, I don't get this. Why? Okay, we go through those. But somehow you look back now, and I see the hand of God. And I see what God was up to. And I was telling Billy, I said, I think what happened is that's what made me become a dialed-in father. I think if my son had not had the struggles he had in first, second, third, fourth grade, I would have probably been a clueless dad. But we're close today as adults, I think, because of what he went through, and I had to be involved. Praying together every morning, teaching him how to deal with the problems that resulted at school because of the condition he had. What's the reason? If we look from our perspective, we interpret all of life through the gospel of Christ and what he did for us. And I want you to look back at John chapter 1, and I'll end with this passage, John 1. And I want to read it to you this is from the ESV, John 1. The scripture's on the screen. In the beginning was the Word. We're trying to see, can we find reason or meaning to any of this? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He, the Word, He was in the beginning with God. For all the way back to the beginning of creation, He was there. Verse 3, all things were made through Him, and without Him not anything was made that was made. Verse 14, and the Word was in the beginning with God, and the Word was God. And He, the Word, verse 14, became flesh and dwelt among us. Now it's talking about Jesus. And we have seen His glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. You get the picture? In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then the Word became flesh. Jesus took on human flesh. God Himself took human flesh, came and walked on earth, dispensing grace and truth. That's the picture. Now, I mentioned a Hebrew word in the Old Testament. The New Testament was written primarily in Greek. And the word there, if you look at that word we're reading, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word with that word, okay? In the Greek, it's logos. Maybe you've heard of that word. If you've been around church circles for very long, the word logos. It wasn't particularly and primarily a religious word. What it meant in the Greek language, it could be translated word, but it also meant reason. Logos, reason. And here's I read you the NIV and I read you the ESV translation. I want to read you the WSM translation. That's the William Stephen Murrell translation. You've never read that one, fortunately. Here it is. In the beginning was the reason. What it says here is in the beginning was the Word, the logos. The word logos means reason. In the beginning was the reason. And the reason for life was God. The reason was in the beginning with God, and all things were made with a reason. Without a reason, nothing that was made was made. Verse 14, and the reason for living became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. The reason for life is a person. The reason for living, the reason for your existence is not a bank account, it's not a street address, it's not a house, it's not something to impress your mom. The reason for life, it's not a sunset and it's not a water slide. The reason for life is a person, and His name is Jesus Christ. And when we meet Him, we find our reason. We find our purpose. We find what life is about, and we get over ourselves and we get into Him. And suddenly things begin to make sense. And what didn't make sense before does make sense now, and now my life is not just a vapor here today, gone tomorrow, and it doesn't really matter. Because when we meet Him, He deals with the real problem, which is sin. He cleanses it. He convicts it first, then He cleanses it, He erases it, He wipes it out, and He gives us the power to walk beyond it. And then we walk into a purpose, and we get up every day in life with a reason to live that's centered around Him. Solomon asked the question, what's the point of all the toil? all the work that people do in life, is there really a reason? Yeah, there's a reason. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, the reason. And that Word, that Logos, that reason became flesh and lived the life we should have lived and died the death we should have died so that he could offer us the free gift of eternal life if we would simply get over ourselves and put our faith in him. You know what happens, though, for some of us like Solomon? You're going, okay, Pastor, I did that. I did that last semester. I did that last year. I did that 5 years ago. But then success hits, and then we start detouring. So you know what? Tonight, it'd be a great night to get off the detour and back on the track. And if you've never met the reason face to face, this would be a great night to do that.